The day my mother laughed at my work, I realized I had been paying to be disrespected. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was the quiet, kind, short, dismissive, like a breath pushed out through the nose that landed heavier than shouting ever could. I remember exactly where I was standing when it happened. Barefoot on the cool kitchen tile, my laptop open on the counter, a mug of coffee going cold beside me. Outside, a delivery truck hissed to a stop. Inside, my mother's voice cut through the hum of the refrigerator. "Must be nice," she said, waving her hand toward my screen. "To play on a computer all day and call it a career." I smiled then. I always smiled. Because smiling had become my way of keeping the peace in a house I was fully funding but never fully welcome in. My name is Avery Scott. I'm a freelance engineer. And for 3 years, every light in that house stayed on because of me. When people imagine engineers, they picture hard hats and job sites, not someone working remotely from a spare bedroom with a standing desk and noise-canceling headphones. They don't picture late nights staring at lines of code, troubleshooting systems for companies scattered across time zones, or the steady, quiet pressure of being responsible not just for yourself but for everyone under your roof. I lived with my parents after a messy breakup and a cross-country return that felt temporary at first. Just a few months, I told myself. Enough time to regroup. Enough time to save. Enough time to help them while I figured out my next step. That was before my freelance contracts took off. Before one client recommended me to another. And suddenly my calendar filled with deadlines and video calls and invoices that paid more in a month than my father's old job ever had. My father was proud of me. He never said it loudly, he was never that kind of man, but I saw it in the way he lingered at my door, pretending to ask about the Wi-Fi while really just listening to me explain a project. I saw it in the way he nodded when I talked about system architecture, even if he didn't understand all of it. He trusted that I knew what I was doing. My mother didn't. To her, work was something you left the house for, something you dressed up for, something that came with a boss you feared, and a paycheck that arrived every 2 weeks like clockwork. Anything else felt suspicious, temporary, not real. She never said thank you when I covered the mortgage after my father retired early. Never acknowledged the grocery deliveries I scheduled, the utilities I set to autopay, the insurance premiums I quietly absorbed. It was as if money appeared by magic, and my only role was to sit in my room and play on my computer. Still, our life had a rhythm back then. Mornings were quiet. My mother liked her routine toast slightly burnt, black tea steeped too long, the radio murmuring old songs from the 70s. My father shuffled around in slippers, reading the newspaper even though the print made him squint. I worked with my door cracked open, listening to the soft creak of the house I'd grown up in. In the evenings, we ate together. Simple meals, stews and casseroles. I cooked more often than not, because I got home earlier, home being a short walk from my desk to the kitchen. My mother would comment on the seasoning, sometimes approving, sometimes not. But I learned to accept that as her version of conversation. We weren't close, but we weren't at war either. My brother Brandon visited occasionally. He was older than me by 4 years. Louder, more confident. The kind of man who took up space without apologizing. He had married Chloe 2 years earlier, a woman with perfect hair and a habit of speaking just a little too sweetly, like every sentence was wrapped in frosting. They never stayed long. Brandon complained about the guest room mattress. Chloe complained about the neighborhood. They left behind empty wine bottles and the faint smell of expensive perfume. And my mother always sighed after they drove away. "Such busy lives," she'd say, as if admiration could cover disappointment. I didn't mind their visits. They were temporary, like storms you could watch from the window. Everything changed the morning my father collapsed. It was early, too early for panic to feel real. I heard a dull thud from the hallway, followed by my mother calling his name in a voice I'd never heard before. Sharp. Afraid, I found him on the floor. His skin gray, his breath shallow. The smell of metal filled my nose. Blood pressure, cough. Ambulance siren. Hospital lights so bright they hurt. In the waiting room, my mother paced until the carpet flattened beneath her steps. She wrung her hands, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. I sat still, my phone buzzing with missed calls and unread emails. My world narrowed to the slow passing of minutes. When the doctor finally came out and said stable, my mother cried into my shoulder like I was the parent and she was the child. That was the moment I thought everything would change. For a few days, it did. She spoke softly to me, asked if I was eating enough, thanked me for handling the insurance calls. My father squeezed my hand from his hospital bed and told me, in a hoarse whisper, that he was proud of the woman I'd become. Then, one afternoon, while I was on a video call with a client in Seattle, I heard my mother's voice rise in the living room. "They'll move in," she said, decisive. "Just for a while." I muted my microphone and leaned closer to the door. "They can't afford their place anymore," she continued. "And with your father like this, we need family around." Family. That was how Brandon and Chloe entered our house, not as guests, but as a solution, as support, as reinforcements. No one asked me what I thought. I unmuted my call, nodded at my client, and felt something quiet settle in my chest. Not anger yet, not fear, just the faint, steady awareness that the balance in that house was about to tip and that I was standing right under it. When Brandon and Chloe moved in, it was as if the air in the house shifted thicker, heavier, like the windows had suddenly closed and trapped us all inside. They arrived mid-morning, hauling bags that smelled of expensive perfume and fast food wrappers. Their laughter loud enough to make my mother smile for the first time in weeks. Brandon clapped me on the back, a rough gesture meant as a greeting, but it landed awkwardly, like he was reminding me I wasn't part of the new arrangement. Chloe's smile was sharp and practiced, like a mask that never quite slipped. She hugged my mother, nodded politely at me, then claimed the guest room as her own. I stood in the hallway, watching them move through my home as if it were theirs to conquer. At first, I tried to keep things civil. I told myself it was temporary. I reminded myself that family helped each other in times of crisis. I even offered to adjust my work schedule, hoping to share the load of caregiving. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. The first morning, I woke to the sound of voices, my mother's sharp and clipped, Brandon's booming and impatient. I slipped into the kitchen and found them crowded around the table, coffee cups half empty, papers and bills strewn across the surface. "Your freelancing isn't a real job," Brandon said, voice low but deliberate. "How can you call yourself an engineer if you don't work in an office?" My mother nodded, folding her arms. "I never understood how you could sit in your room all day and make any money at all." I stood frozen, the mug in my hand trembling slightly. "I handle complex projects," I said softly. "I design systems that run entire companies. It's just remote." Brandon snorted. "Remote means you don't have to deal with real people, real problems." Chloe leaned in, her smile thin. "Maybe if you did some actual housework, Avery, you'd understand." I blinked, caught off guard. "I do housework." "Sure, you do," Chloe said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "But somehow the trash is always full. And the laundry? I'm still waiting for that mountain to disappear." My mother sighed, shaking her head like she was correcting a child. "You're here to help, not to be the maid." The words hit harder than I expected. I dropped my mug on the counter, the clatter echoing louder than I wanted. I was providing for this house. I was the reason the bills got paid. And here I was being treated like I didn't belong, like I was the problem. Days passed in a blur of whispered complaints behind my back, small humiliations delivered with smiles, and constant undermining of everything I did. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage where I was the scapegoat, the outsider. One evening, after a long day of meetings and a client deadline that stretched into midnight, I came home exhausted. The house was noisy, Brandon's loud music in the living room, Chloe's phone calls with friends, my mother bustling about, all without a thought for quiet. I dropped my bags by the door, called out that I needed a moment to work in peace. No answer. I went to my room, closed the door, and pulled out my laptop. Minutes later, the door banged open. Brandon leaned in, a mocking grin on his face. "Seriously, Avery, you think you're special because you can click keys all day? Go clean the kitchen. Chloe and Mom can't be your personal staff." My throat tightened. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood and looked at him calmly. "I'm not your maid." His grin faded, replaced by something colder. "Not yet," he said. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house breathe around me, wondering how the people who were supposed to love me could treat me like I was invisible, or worse, a burden. I began to realize something I hadn't fully admitted before. I was the backbone of that family. The money, the stability, the quiet work behind the scenes that kept everything running. And they resented me for it. I felt trapped, angry, hurt. But most of all, I felt ready to leave. Packing wasn't easy. The apartment I found was small and modest, not much like the house I was raised in, but it was mine. My sanctuary. Before I left, I made a choice. I opened my bank app and transferred every penny I had contributed to the household accounts into my personal savings. It was quiet, revenge, not loud or destructive, but precise and effective. I left a note on the kitchen table. "I'm no one's maid. This house is no longer my home. Use the money wisely." I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. 2 days later, my phone rang. Brandon's name flashed on the screen. His voice was panicked. "Avery, please. I lost my job. Chloe and we don't have any money. Mom's bills are piling up. Can you help us?" I took a deep breath, feeling the calm I hadn't known in months settle over me. "I'm sorry, Brandon. I can't." I hung up, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Brandon's call echoed in my mind long after I hung up. The panic in his voice was raw, an unmasked desperation that clawed at me. But underneath it all, I felt something else. Relief. Not from their crisis, but from the burden I'd carried so quietly for years. In the days that followed, I focused on my own life. The apartment, though small, became a sanctuary where I could breathe without the constant weight of judgment. The walls were bare at first, but slowly I added touches. A plant by the window, a soft rug that muted the city's noise, the scent of fresh coffee in the mornings. Work flourished. Without the interruptions and the hostile undercurrent of the house, I dove deeper into my projects. Clients noticed. Offers came in. My reputation grew, not just as a freelancer, but as someone reliable and driven. Still, I couldn't silence the ache for my father. He was the only piece of that old life I wanted to keep. Our conversations became lifelines. He called every evening, voice tired but warm. "Don't let them get to you, Avery," he said one night, after I'd shared a client's success. "You're stronger than they think." I imagined him in his favorite armchair, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls. His faith in me was steady, unwavering, even when the rest of the family crumbled. Meanwhile, word got around. The house where I had once lived, where I had once been the invisible pillar, was unraveling. Bills went unpaid. The mortgage fell behind. The water was shut off one afternoon, forcing my mother and Brandon to stand outside the cold tap, shivering and cursing. Chloe found a part-time job as a cashier far from the life she'd imagined. Brandon took menial work, driving rideshares late into the night, his pride swallowed by exhaustion. My mother's voice lost its sharp edge. I heard through a mutual friend that she was quieter now, more subdued, no longer mocking but pleading. I didn't respond. I couldn't. One evening, my father surprised me by visiting. I hadn't seen him since his hospital stay. His health had improved, but he was fragile. He stood in my apartment doorway, a small smile breaking through the weariness. "You've built something here," he said softly, eyes scanning the modest space. "I'm proud of you." I held back tears, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything." He shook his head. "You didn't owe them anything. You did what you could." We sat for a while, the silence between us comfortable, filled with unspoken forgiveness and love. I realized then that family isn't always the people who share your roof or your history. Sometimes, family is the quiet support, the steady hand, the unconditional belief when the world turns its back. Looking back, I see how I was trapped by their expectations, not just financially, but emotionally. The idea that I should sacrifice everything for a family that didn't value me. I'm not sorry for leaving. Not sorry for taking back what was mine. Because sometimes, self-respect means walking away. Would my mother, Brandon, and Chloe have changed if I stayed? Maybe. Maybe not. But I had to choose my own peace. And in that choice, I found freedom. It wasn't long after my father's visit that things reached a breaking point on their end. I heard from a neighbor, our old one, the one who always watched the house when I was away, that Brandon and my mother were scrambling, trying to patch holes in their finances. Brandon's pride had been battered. His usual loud confidence was replaced by frantic phone calls and hushed arguments with Chloe. I didn't want to know the details, but I imagined the desperation behind closed doors. Unpaid bills, creditors knocking, the refrigerator growing emptier with each passing day. One afternoon, the silence between my calls and texts became a chasm I could no longer ignore. My mother, voice brittle and unfamiliar, reached out. "Avery, please," she said. "We're struggling. Brandon lost his job completely. Chloe's hours were cut. I don't know what to do." Her words hung heavy in the air, but so did the memory of years spent undermining me, mocking my work, treating me like I was less than a daughter. "I'm sorry, Mom," I replied quietly. "I can't help." There was a long pause. "I wish you had told me how hard it was before." "I tried," I said softly. "But you didn't listen." The line went dead. It struck me then, how often families talk past each other, words exchanged, but not heard. Grievances built like walls, dividing us until all that's left are fractured pieces and regrets. Brandon's situation worsened. Rumors floated that he'd lost even the part-time jobs, caught in a cycle of interviews and rejections. Chloe took on cleaning gigs, anything to keep the bills from piling higher. I didn't gloat or feel vindicated. I felt a quiet sorrow. This wasn't the ending I wanted for my family, but it was the natural consequence of choices made of resentment allowed to grow like weeds, choking out love and respect. In the middle of it all, my father's health declined again. I made the trip to the hospital, sitting by his bedside with a calm I didn't quite feel inside. He looked at me, frail but steady. You did what you had to do, he whispered, voice cracking. You stood your ground. Tears pooled in my eyes, and I squeezed his hand. Thank you, Dad. Those words were more than gratitude, they were healing. A balm for wounds I hadn't realized I was carrying. When he passed months later, I was ready. Not because I wasn't heartbroken, because I was, but because I had finally learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, love means standing firm, even when it hurts. After the funeral, I found my mother and Brandon sitting quietly, the weight of their loss settling over them. They no longer had the strength to fight or blame. I wished I could reach across the distance that had grown between us. But I also knew some bridges burned slowly, built on too much pain. I moved forward with my life, opening doors I had once closed, reconnecting with friends, exploring new opportunities. The scars of betrayal and rejection remained, but they no longer defined me. In the quiet moments, I think about family, the complicated, messy, beautiful thing it is. How sometimes, those who should hold you up try to push you down. And how, sometimes, the greatest act of love is choosing to walk away so you can find your own light. The moment I stepped fully into my own life, the quiet power of self-respect settled in. It wasn't a sudden burst, like in movies where someone throws a glass and yells at everyone to leave. It was quieter, a slow and steady pulse in my chest reminding me who I was and what I deserved. Work became more than just a paycheck. It was a way to prove to myself that I could thrive on my own terms. I took on bigger projects, learned new skills, and built a community of colleagues who respected me not just for what I did, but for who I was. I remember one late evening, after a long day troubleshooting a system failure for a client halfway across the world, I sat on my small balcony, the city lights twinkling below like scattered stars. The air was crisp, and the faint scent of rain mixed with the sound of distant traffic. I thought about everything I'd left behind the house, the people who once called me their daughter, the weight of their expectations. It struck me then how much I had carried without ever asking for a single thank you. But I didn't resent them anymore. I understood now that resentment was a cage, and forgiveness not for their sake, but for mine was the key to freedom. Brandon eventually reached out again, this time with a tone I hadn't heard before, one tempered by humility and regret. I was wrong, Avery, he said quietly during a call. We were wrong. We took you for granted, and I'm sorry. I didn't respond right away. I needed time. Time to process the years of hurt and disappointment. But I did say one thing. Thank you for saying that. I hope you find your way. Chloe, too, sent a message months later, asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. Some wounds need more than words to heal. My mother remained silent. I suspect the weight of her own mistakes was too heavy to bear aloud. The lesson I carry now is one of boundaries, of knowing when to hold on and when to let go, of recognizing that love is not a transaction where you give endlessly and receive contempt in return. Family is a gift, yes, but it's not a burden to carry alone. I am grateful for my father's quiet support, the one who saw me for who I was and never questioned my worth. And I am grateful for the strength I found in walking away. Life doesn't always give us the family we want, but it gives us the chance to build the family we need. To those of you listening, who might feel unseen or undervalued in your own homes, know this. You deserve respect. You deserve to be heard. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to choose yourself. As the months passed, the fallout from my departure rippled through the lives I left behind, and the family I once carried on my shoulders began to unravel. I heard from neighbors and mutual acquaintances more often than I wanted, whispers of unpaid bills, eviction notices, and the slow collapse of the household that had been my responsibility. It wasn't easy to hear, but I told myself it was the consequence of choices they had made, the weight of their refusal to appreciate what had been given freely. Brandon, who once walked through life with a swagger, was now a shadow of himself, strained and hunched from endless hours working menial jobs. Chloe, no longer the polished woman who wore smiles like armor, looked tired and defeated. My mother, who once wielded authority with sharp words, had retreated into silence, her disapproval replaced by an unspoken remorse. What struck me most was how their community responded. Family, friends, and relatives, who had once praised me quietly behind my back, began asking pointed questions. When the money dried up and the bill stacked higher, they looked at my mother and Brandon with sympathy, but also with judgment. It's sad, one neighbor said, shaking her head. They treated Avery like dirt, and now they're struggling without her. I stayed quiet, watching from a distance as the consequences unfolded, not out of spite, but because there was nothing more I could do without sacrificing my own peace. One afternoon, a message popped up on my phone from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Hey, Avery, it read. I just want you to know, we're all sorry for how things went down. You did what you had to. Stay strong. It was the first acknowledgement of my truth from the wider family circle, and it felt like a quiet vindication. Not because I wanted praise, but because finally, someone saw the burden I carried and the grace with which I let it go. In the professional world, my reputation blossomed. Word spread of my reliability and skill, and new doors opened. Offers came not just for freelance work, but for permanent positions, mentoring roles, even speaking engagements. I found myself standing in front of virtual audiences, sharing my story, not the family drama, but the resilience and strength it took to rise despite it. What I realized was this: respect isn't given, it's earned. And sometimes, it must be demanded. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't plot ruin or hold grudges. Instead, I chose to build a life so full of purpose and integrity that nothing could shake it. As for my family, I wished them well, truly. But I also learned that some lessons must be learned the hard way, and sometimes, the person who carries you is the one who decides to step away. In those quiet moments when I reflect on everything, I understand that love isn't about sacrificing yourself until you're empty. It's about recognizing your worth, setting boundaries, and knowing that sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go. The months stretched into years, and slowly, I rebuilt what I had lost only this time. I built it for myself. My new apartment grew into a home. The walls were decorated with art from friends, books that I loved, and photos that reminded me of the people who had truly supported me. I cultivated a quiet life, one filled with work that challenged me, friendships that uplifted me, and the peace I had craved for so long. Sometimes, I felt the pull of loneliness, that ache that comes when you distance yourself from family, even if they have hurt you. But in those moments, I reminded myself that peace was worth the price. I reconnected with old friends, the kind who saw me not just as a provider or a caretaker, but as a person with dreams and fears and hopes. We shared dinners filled with laughter and conversations that stretched into the night. It was a new kind of family, built on respect and understanding. My father remained my anchor until the end. His quiet strength and belief in me were gifts I carried in my heart. After his passing, I felt a void but also a profound sense of gratitude. I had learned so much from him about kindness, resilience, and the importance of standing firm in one's truth. I often think about my mother, Brandon, and Chloe, not with bitterness, but with compassion. I understand now that people's actions come from their own fears and limitations. Their inability to accept my career, my independence, and the help I offered was not a reflection of my worth, but their own struggles. The lesson I want to share is this: we cannot control how others see us or treat us, but we can control how we respond. We can choose boundaries. We can choose to walk away from toxicity, and we can choose to build a life that honors who we truly are. Would you have made the same choices I did? Would you have stayed or left? I invite you to think about the families in your life, the love and the burdens, the gratitude and the resentments. How do you protect your own peace while loving others? Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts. Because sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is to speak our truth. When I look back on everything, the years of carrying the weight of my family's needs, the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, and the moment I finally chose myself, I wonder, how often do we sacrifice our own well-being for those who don't see our value? It's a question that doesn't come with easy answers. Sometimes love means giving, and sometimes love means stepping away to protect your own heart. If you've ever felt unseen or unappreciated by those closest to you, know this: you are not alone. Your feelings are valid. Your boundaries matter. I hope my story reminds you that strength isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it's in the quiet resolve to say, I deserve respect. I deserve peace. Would you have made the choices I did? Would you have stayed and fought, or left to find your own freedom? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Your voice matters. And if this story touched you, consider subscribing to support more stories like this. Stories of real people, real struggles, and real hope. Thank you for listening. Remember, your peace is worth protecting.